What a weekend for college football. Texas is back. Miami is also maybe back, and the Pac 12 might have straight up jumped both the Big Ten and the SEC to be the best conference in college football. Hello and welcome to the JSA studio. I am your host, as always, Nathan, and today we're going to be recapping college football week 2. But before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to like the video if you end up liking it, and subscribe if you want to see more commentary like this. And also, every Wednesday, we do film breakdowns on this channel on a multitude of interesting college football players. I'm also going to encourage you to leave a comment down in the comment section below, especially if you disagreed with me. Let's just keep it civil. After all, what do I know? I'm just some asshole on the internet telling you his opinion. Now, let's go ahead and get started with the biggest story from this past weekend: Texas making a statement that they are officially back and a national force to be reckoned with. It seems that Steve Sarkisian has finally gotten the program on the rails and headed in the right direction. So let's go ahead and stay on the Texas side of things here. This is quite obviously the biggest win in a very long time. Maybe you have to go back to 2018 when you beat Georgia in the Sugar Bowl. Maybe it's even before that. I don't know. But for the rest of this season, who are you scared of on your schedule? Oklahoma? They don't got the D-line that Alabama got. They don't got the secondary that Alabama got. And they don't have the offensive line that Alabama has. And they don't have the receiving talent that Alabama has. They don't have the running backs that Alabama has. Oklahoma's solid. I mean, they might go 11-1 because their schedule is soft. But I don't think they stand a chance against you. I think you're clearly a better football team. I think you win that game 9 times out of 10 this year, based off of what I've seen out of Oklahoma and what I've seen out of you. And I mean, obviously, Dillon Gabriel is a good quarterback. I'm not going to deny that. But he can't run like Jalen Milroe, and he's probably a better passer than Jalen Milroe. But without that threat of a run, you're going to be able to actually play defense in a way that could shut down the game. You're going to be able to dedicate more people to coverage without having to worry about Jalen Milroe scrambling. I mean, Dillon Gabriel can move, but he's not really a run threat like Jalen Milroe is. And you know another thing? You didn't play great on offense for 3 out of 4 quarters against Alabama. Now, last quarter you turned it on, and that's when you needed it. But that was far, far from the best that you can play, and you ended up pulling it out. In spite of the fact that there were some miscues, there were a lot of yards left on the table, in my opinion, and you were playing against a top 5 defense in the country, in my opinion. I think Alabama's defense is that good, and you kind of figured it out late in the game. I don't think Oklahoma's defense is that good. Oklahoma is the only team on the schedule, maybe Kansas State, but Oklahoma is pretty much the only team on your schedule that I think could provide a serious threat to you if you have like a B-, C+ type of day. So you as a program right now for this year are sitting pretty. At this point, even if you do manage to slip up and get upset by Oklahoma or Kansas State, or maybe just an offense gets hot like Kansas or Oklahoma State or somebody, and you end up losing a game, I still think you're probably going to win the Big 12. And if you're 1 loss or 0 losses and you win the Big 12, you're probably going to make the playoffs. I believe that Quinn Ewers played really well, and I think propelled himself back into that QB3 conversation for this upcoming draft class with his play during this game. He will almost certainly be the subject of that film breakdown on Wednesday that I mentioned in the intro, so be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't end up missing that. But there were still definitely some things that he needs to improve on, some passes that he missed that he really shouldn't have missed, a lot of mechanical issues and footwork issues that he overcame just because he's so ridiculously talented. He will definitely be a fun breakdown. Moving on to the Alabama perspective. If you're Alabama, you've got to understand that this was an extremely motivated Texas team. not only for their head coach to beat the guy that he worked for many years, but also to make a statement and to say, we're coming to the SEC next year. We are not just going to get bullied the whole time. We are here. We are a real program, and we are going to be a problem for the SEC. Or at least that's what the statement that they were trying to make is. Not only were they trying to get revenge for the game last year that they believe they should have won, but also to announce on a national scale that they have arrived. Steve Sarkisian needed a program building win, and unfortunately you fell victim to that, in my opinion. However, it also was pretty clear to see that at least on this day, Texas was a better football team than you. And that is concerning if the goal is still national championship, which you're fucking Alabama, it better be national championship. So you've definitely got some stuff to work on. And the main thing is going to be Jalen Milroe's progression as a passer. He showed flashes. He showed glimpses of being an elite thrower of the football. He made some wow kind of throws during this game, and some seriously impressive runs and illusions and extensions on plays, runs for first downs, that lead me to understand why he's starting over some of the lower ceiling guys that you have on this team, even though Jalen Milroe's 2 interceptions undoubtedly played a massive impact on this game. But they were not the single biggest problem that you had in this game. That was penalties. And I don't know if this is just the status quo now, because it's been kind of a year and a half now where penalties have been a problem. But Nick Saban ultimately, I think, is going to get it figured out, which leads me to my ultimate point, and the point that I want you to take away from this if you're an Alabama fan. And that's, everything is still on the table for you. Now, you no longer have a margin for error. However, I also think in terms of matchups for the rest of your schedule, the toughest game is out of the way. You might say Georgia in the SEC championship game, that could be a tougher game, but I think that game would just be a defensive slugfest, and it'd be like 50-50 who wins. I think Texas, because of Quinn Ewers' ability to throw the ball and to move around and how well that he played specifically, which I don't think Georgia has a quarterback like that, or at least I haven't seen it out of Carson Beck. Is that his name? I think that's him. So that would just be a defensive battle, and you're built for those kinds of games. You're built to be able to run the football and grind it out, and then to get stronger in the fourth quarter. I think you have better running backs than Georgia. I think the offensive line is a push. I think you're both probably top 10 units in the country, and I think you both probably have top 5 defenses in the country. So you're really well matched up, but Texas had so much depth on the defensive line, and they rotated so well that it really was just a tremendously bad matchup for you, and I'm not sure Georgia can pull that off to the same degree that an extraordinarily motivated Texas team can't. They've got the depth to do it. We know their coaching staff is elite, but we don't know if their players are going to be as motivated as the Texas players were to win this game. So you've got South Florida this next week. Little bit of a warm-up, get-right game, and then you're playing Ole Miss the following week. And I think Ole Miss is going to be the victim of a Alabama team that is announcing to the country, we are still here, and we are still a contender for everything. And for Texas, you've got Wyoming and then Baylor, then maybe a sneaky test in Kansas. You're looking ahead to Oklahoma the next week. Got to watch out for Kansas. That does read trap game pretty obviously. But honestly, I'm glad to have Texas back. It's like running into an old friend that you knew from high school a long time ago, or elementary school or something. And Texas wasn't the only old friend that we happened to run into this week. Making a statement against a team that everybody thought was going to win and maybe announce that they we're back into the national conversation. Miami obliterated Texas A&M this past week. Tyler Van Dyke looked like a first-round quarterback again out of nowhere. I guess that just goes to show you how horrible Josh Gaddis was as a play caller. I mean, I was a Michigan fan. I was never particularly fond of his play calling, but he had also never called plays before he went to Michigan, so I thought it was just kind of like a learning curve thing. Turns out he might just be horrible, and he won the Broyles Award for the best assistant coach in all of college football. That might go down as one of the worst award winners of all time. Now, the defense is still probably going to keep you from legitimately competing for the ACC this year, but you've taken a step in the right direction. And in year two, that's what you're looking for. Like, I think if you end up 9-3, you got to tip your hat to Mario Cristobal and be like, you've got this program going in the right direction. And speaking of programs going in the right direction, UCLA might have themselves a superstar at quarterback in five-star freshman Dante Moore. Chip Kelly is obviously a very good offensive coach and a excellent offensive play caller. I honestly don't think he really did all that bad at Philadelphia in the NFL either. He just didn't have a quarterback. So he's been fairly successful at everywhere that he's gone. It really shouldn't have surprised anybody that he righted the ship for UCLA. When that was announced, what has it been, 4 or 5 years now? When that was announced, I was like, oh man, what a great hire by UCLA. I hope they give him the time to build that program up to be something special. And it seems that they've done that. They let Chip Kelly build that program up to the point where the offense appears to be plug and play now. They did struggle week 1 against Coastal Carolina, looked much better this past week. And I honestly think that was probably because Dante Moore was playing more. But the defense looks improved. They're still probably not good, but they don't appear to be as big of a liability as it was last year. You're a sneaky team. You could do some damage in the Pac-12, but you are not going to do as much damage as Penn State is going to do. Penn State isn't an old friend returning. That's what you're saying. No, Penn State is the guy that's been working at the local business in your small town that his uncle owns or whatever the fuck, and just kind of coasted by. And then all of a sudden his uncle retired and he took over the program. And now the business is expanding and he's getting like $1 million investments from New York City and all this shit. And all of a sudden he's cleaning his act up a little bit. He's got a girlfriend. Like, what the fuck is going on? You look at him and you're just like, you were just some asshole a minute ago. Now you're goddamn the king of the town. Yes, this is hyperbolic what I am about to say, but Penn State might be the best team in the country. They are loaded with first-round caliber players. They have 2 or 3 draftable wide receivers and a quality tight end to go along with an offensive line that sneakily has been the best in the Big Ten throughout 2 games. Now, it is just 2 games, and I think Michigan will probably get it together. I'm not sure Ohio State's offensive line will, but that's a conversation for a little bit later in the video. But Olu Fashanu is likely going to be a top 10 pick, if not a top 5 pick. I think if the quarterback class wasn't as loaded as it is, and we'll talk about the quarterback class towards the end of this video, but in a normal year, Olu Fashanu might be legitimately a number 1 overall pick type of contender. Joe Alt is also sort of, in that category. I think Olu Fashanu is clearly better than Joe Alt. I don't really understand why people are saying Joe Alt is like tackle 1 in this upcoming class. But Penn State also has Chop Robinson, who's going to be a top 20 pick. They have Kalen King, who's going to be a first-round corner as well. Abdul Carter at the second level of that defense isn't eligible for the draft this year, but if he was, he'd be a top 15 pick. He's spectacular. He might be the second best linebacker in the Big Ten. And he's pushing Tommy Eichenberg for me right now. If you've been around for a minute, you know how much I love Tommy Eichenberg. So that's a hell of a compliment that I'm paying him. So I'm for real. I'm all in on Penn State right now. And honestly, I'm going to compare them to 2021 Michigan because I'm a Michigan fan, and I also just think this analogy is really good. Like, I think there's a lot of connections between those 2 teams. Like, everybody in the Michigan media scene, or at least the ones that I followed on social media and you read occasionally on online sites, fan sites, and stuff like that, was talking about how this team feels different and this offensive line feels different. The defense with Aiden Hutchinson and a breakout superstar in this kid named David Ajabo looks different. It feels different. This Penn State team has that same feel to me. This feels like the team that is going to get over the hump, that is finally going to break the curse of you always lose to Michigan for some reason, and even though you always play arguably your best game of the year against Ohio State, you still just always lose. But this year, I think it's different. This year, I think right now, if you put a gun to my head, I would pick Penn State to win the Big Ten, because I've seen everything out of Penn State, and Ohio State and Michigan still have several question marks for me. Penn State has none, literally none. And they also are the only one of those three teams that has played at least a decent Power 5 team in West Virginia, and they obliterated them. That game was complete domination. So you've also got the best win of any of these teams right now. Now, Ohio State is playing a excellent Notre Dame team, which might be the best Notre Dame team since 2012 in week 4, not this week, but the following week. And then Michigan starts to play some Big Ten opponents, so we'll kind of figure out what they're going to be soon thereafter. So it could change. But right now, Penn State has been the most impressive to me. I've just spent a lot of time talking about Michigan, Penn State, and Ohio State, so let's just go ahead and talk about those three teams even more. All three of these teams, in my opinion, hit for par, but they all improved relative to the Big Ten, because Wisconsin might not be the team that I thought they were heading into this year. It might take Luke Fickell a little bit longer than I thought it would to get that program up and running again. Maryland did not look great for a big stretch of that Charlotte game. Illinois got obliterated by Kansas, and Purdue also isn't great. Minnesota's offense looks like constipation personified, and Iowa is what they've always been. Great on defense, phenomenal on defense, maybe the best defense in the Big Ten year in and year out, and really bad on offense. I thought this was the year that we might start to see a little bit of parity in the Big Ten, where you might see some of these smaller, not as successful recently programs kind of step up a little bit, but that just hasn't been the case. So Penn State, Ohio State, and the University of Michigan, I think, also improved their chances somehow. But what do I mean by hitting for par? Basically, they were the same as my expectations after they played in week 1. Ohio State did look better offensively somewhat. They hit some big plays, but there was also a lot of scheming extra protection against a Youngstown State team that you really shouldn't need to scheme up extra protection on. This offensive line scares me if I'm Ohio State. I have never in my life, I was born in 1997, I have never in my life seen an Ohio State offensive line look like this Ohio State offensive line has looked these past 2 weeks. And I predicted you to win the national championship. I predicted you to win the Big Ten. I was all aboard the Ohio State bandwagon this year. I said in my preseason top 25 video that the only reason you weren't ranked number 1 was because Georgia had just won back-to-back national championships. And I still believe in you, but the offensive line is really scaring me. Penn State obliterated Delaware like I thought they were going to obliterate Delaware. I mean, they're playing Delaware, but I actually raised my expectations after West Virginia for this team. The Penn State of old does not win that game by the margin that they won that game by, and they don't look like they looked winning that game either. Michigan, on the other hand, it's like the reverse of last year. If you remember last year, there was a lot of question marks about the passing game, and the offensive line didn't particularly pass block very well at the beginning of the year, but they were dominant in the run game. This year, the passing game looks all there. It is somewhat concerning that we haven't seen a true deep shot yet, because that was the area that J.J. McCarthy struggled the most in last year. However, it looks like we're actually running a competent offensive system for the passing game now, so that's really good. But the running game hasn't been consistent or really all that good so far. And I guess the starting tackles are just going to be Carson Barnhart and Miles Hinton, which was not something I was expecting. But I do think the offensive line is going to get it together. I think they're going to be able to run the ball when they need to be able to run the ball. So this week, I knew that they weren't going to take any shots downfield, really. I knew that they weren't going to try to put up big numbers, that they were going to try to be balanced again, and that J.J. McCarthy was likely going to be the most effective part of our offense. So they hit for par this week. They haven't exceeded my expectations this week. Ohio State has sort of lessened my expectations, and Penn State has sort of skyrocketed my expectations. But that was after week 1. Week 2, they're about the same. They're the same as they were at the end of week 1. The rest of the Big Ten, not so much. I mean, Nebraska got embarrassed by Colorado. Illinois lost. I already said that. Iowa did beat Iowa State, but like, is that even really a rivalry? Iowa's won like 9 of the last 10 or some shit like that. And also, Iowa State has been horrible the past few years, so that's not impressive to me. Maryland struggled with, like a decent Charlotte team. I mean, they got a lot of Power 5 transfers, but honestly, I expected them to look better than the way that they have looked. Wisconsin got beaten by Washington State. I might have been a little bit too high on Wisconsin heading into this season, and there's no might have been about it. I was too high on Wisconsin heading into this season. If you watched my predicting everything about the Big Ten video, then you'll know that I predicted Wisconsin to go 11-1, beating Ohio State. Though I could still see them beating Ohio State for all the reasons that I outlined in that video. It's extraordinarily less likely to happen now that I've actually seen them play and I've seen Ohio State play. Probably not going to happen, but I was a little gung-ho on that anyway. Purdue did manage to beat a rebuilding and not that good Virginia Tech team, another team that I was pretty high on heading into this year, but they have not lived up to my expectations either. Minnesota managed to win. The defense looks really good. The offense looks inept. Michigan State won. Northwestern surprisingly won. Well, it wasn't surprising that they beat UTEP. UTEP isn't a very good program, but the fact that they won a game at all is surprising to me, at least, because they are easily, in my mind, the worst team in a Power 5 conference this year. The SEC, on the other hand, I think probably did worse than the Big Ten. Vanderbilt lost, and in the 2 marquee matchups that they had this week, well, I guess you could argue that they had 3 marquee matchups, but of the 2 Power 5 marquee matchups that they have, they lost both of them in pretty convincing fashion. Ole Miss did manage to beat a Tulane team without their quarterback. I think that game goes differently if Pratt is there. But a good win by Ole Miss. You play who you play, and there's no asterisks or anything. I'm also a Lions fan, so I can't be saying that you got to put an asterisk on wins right now. I mean, LSU blew out somebody. Tennessee didn't look all that good against who they were playing. Georgia won. They blew them out, but they're Georgia. We're expecting them to do that. I think just from an optics standpoint, losing the 2 arguably biggest out-of-conference games, well, Texas is the biggest out-of-conference game that the SEC has this year. There's no question about it. And Miami was another marquee out-of-conference matchup, and you lost that game convincingly. I think, at least for this year, they've both been passed up by the Pac-12 as the best conference in college football. I mean, they've got so many good teams and so many big wins already through this season that I literally couldn't fit all of them on the goddamn screen. I didn't get to put Washington State up on here, and Cal played really good against Auburn. I mean, they left a ton of points on the board, but they were pretty clearly the better football team, and they lost because of so many mistakes. But They were better than a middle of the pack SEC team, and they're not even a middle of the pack Pac 12 team. They're like bottom quarter of the conference. So, via transitive properties, so to speak, the Pac 12 is easily the best conference in college football this year. So, I'm going to real quick run through some of these teams and how utterly impressive they have been. Washington, oh my God, Washington looks like a legitimate national title contender. They look like they can play defense a little bit, and the offense can play with anybody. That might be the best offense in the country. I mean, USC, on the other hand, might also have the best offense in the country, and UCLA's offense could be elite, and Oregon's offense could be elite, and you can't leave out Oregon State either. I mean, they got a former #1 overall recruit running the show who appears to have been held back by Clemson, but Washington really, really looks good. They pass the eye test to me. They probably have the most difficult schedule of anybody because they have to play USC, Utah, Oregon, and Oregon State. And then they end the year with Washington State and, the Apple Cup. It's a rivalry game. You don't really know, but, they should win that game, I think, in my opinion. So they've got the schedule to be able to say we had the most difficult schedule in college football this year because they're playing all these goddamn teams that are really good. And they also have somewhat of a marquee out-of-conference game against Michigan State this week. So you can't ding them with that either. Like, I know people are going to ding Georgia and Michigan this year for not having an out-of-conference game. So they do maybe have a little bit of wiggle room if, their only loss ends up being to USC. They're 11-1. USC is undefeated. They're in the playoff conversation. Washington could sneak in if, say, Alabama runs the table and then loses to Georgia in the SEC championship game. In which case, there's only one SEC team in. I think there's probably only going to be one Big Ten team that gets in because I think in 11-1 Washington, with the schedule that they have, gets in over Penn State, Michigan, or Ohio State with one loss. So they've got a very real path to the playoff and also a little bit of a margin there as well. USC, on the other hand, I think has zero margin. I think if they're making the playoffs, they've got to be undefeated. I mean, Caleb Williams is spectacular. You are never going to be out of a football game as long as you have Caleb Williams. He might be the best player in college football. I mean, Travis Hunter, Shader Sanders, Michael Penix. There's a lot of really good football players this year, but Caleb Williams is right up there with anybody. But once again, the defense appears to be a problem. And I don't know what it is with Lincoln Riley, where he just can't have a defense that gets put together and can actually play defense. I mean, it's been his whole career now as a head coach. They can't play defense. His teams just can't play defense. And part of it is because the offense is so good and they score so many points that the defense is out on the field longer. But even early on in games, they're still not very good. So because of that reputation and everything that goes along with it, I don't believe USC can make the playoff as an 11-1 non-conference champion. Utah, on the other hand, survived a scare against Baylor. I mean, they really need Cam Rising back at this point. I don't think Cam Rising is a particularly good college football quarterback, but you really need to get him back because he's definitely better than the product you threw out there against Baylor. I don't think Baylor's very good. Baylor, I'm not even sure, makes a bowl game this year, and that was a struggle win. So I am somewhat concerned about Utah. Oregon put a lot of my concerns to rest against a seemingly now underrated Texas Tech team that unfortunately got caught looking ahead to this week's game in week 1. But I still think Texas Tech is a quality football team, even though I did think they were a little bit overrated coming into the season. I still think 8-4 is on the table for them. They don't have a whole lot of margin for error. And you beat them. You looked good doing it too. And Oregon State and UCLA are both in very similar positions in my mind. I think you've got the answer at quarterback. I think the teams are solid. I just think they're getting dwarfed by these other 4 teams this year. I just don't think that they can compete with Washington, USC right now. Oregon and Utah, they could potentially be an upset, but that would be a pretty major upset in my mind. UCLA could maybe beat USC. I mean, it's a rivalry game. You don't know. Chip Kelly does kind of need to win that game a little bit. He's not going to get fired or anything, but it would take a lot of pressure off of him if he won that game this year. And the same kind of thing with Oregon and Oregon State. They don't need to win that game to keep their job, but it would take a tremendous amount of pressure off of them if they won that game. Top to bottom right now, the Pac-12 for this year is the best team in college football, and that is spectacular to think about because they were the worst conference of the Power 5 conferences for like 5 straight years outside of last year. Last year, they weren't the worst in the conference. That was the Big 12. Nevertheless, even though the Pac-12 is dead, they're going out with a bang. And another thing that correlates with the Pac-12 and also being explosive is the 2024 quarterback class. I mean, this class is absolutely absurd. It is unbelievable how much talent there is in this quarterback class. Heading into this year, before some players played out of their minds and propelled themselves not only into the draft conversation, but into the first round draft conversation, I had 19 QBs with draftable grades, and I'm going to read them off to you. You got Caleb Williams, Drake May, Quinn Ewers, Joe Milton, Spencer Rattler, Shader Sanders, Michael Penix, Bo Nix, Cam Ward, Jordan Travis, Jaden Daniels, Grayson McCall, J.J. McCarthy, Riley Leonard, KJ Jefferson, Hudson Carr, Will Rogers, Tulila Tagovailoa, and I ran out of room to put Sam Hartman on there. By the way, they weren't in any order. They were just the 19 names that I had coming into this year as a draftable quarterback grade. And none of that even includes guys like Kyle McCord or Devin Leary or Michael Pratt or Tyler Van Dyke, who has propelled himself back into the first round quarterback conversation. So there might be 20 quarterbacks that could get drafted in this upcoming draft class, which is an absurd statement to think about. And there might be 9 that end up with first round grades for me, which is another absolutely clinically insane thing to think about. I mean, there are 7 guys that I am very confident would end up first round picks, even in a loaded quarterback class like this. And that's Caleb Williams, Drake May, Spencer Rattler, Shader Sanders, Michael Penix, J.J. McCarthy, and honestly, I haven't done a deep dive on his film yet, but Quinn Ewers, based off of the physical talent, is probably a guy that ends up going in the first round as well. A little bit less certain on Quinn Ewers than I am the other 6 guys, but I don't really see a scenario with the hype. He was the number 1 recruit in his class. I just don't particularly see a scenario where he doesn't end up a first round pick, having done what he did to Alabama this past week. And even if he plays mediocre like he did last year for the rest of the season, I still think having that tape and combining that with the physical tools is enough to get him in the first round. And even on top of those 7 guys that I'm fairly confident end up as first round picks, there are 4 more guys that I think could go in the first round as well if I can see a little bit more out of them in this season. That's Joe Milton, Bo Nix, Cam Ward, and Riley Leonard out of Duke. With Joe Milton, it's kind of just, I haven't really seen him play anybody, really. He has all the physical tools in the world. He is the most physically gifted quarterback in this class, and this is a class full of absolute freaks of nature. He might be the second most physically gifted quarterback I've ever seen behind Anthony Richardson from this past year. Bo Nix is very clean. I just question the ceiling with him. He seems to me like a Derek Carr level of quarterback, kind of on that lower end of second tier. And with so many guys that are ridiculously high ceilings in this upcoming class, I'm not sure he ends up in the first round. People are sleeping on Cam Ward out of Washington State. Not sure he comes out. I wouldn't if I was him, but man, that kid is really, really talented. Unfortunately, the Pac-12 is absolutely loaded this year, so he's getting kind of swept under the rug, but he's a very, very good player. And the last one, Riley Leonard, is a little bit of hype just because he beat Clemson, and I still think Clemson's defense is very talented and good. And he looked really good in that game. I wouldn't say great. There was definitely some meat left on the bone in the passing game. Running the ball, I did not expect him to look like that, but that was impressive. I mean, this quarterback class, just in general, is going to break records this year. I assume a lot of these guys are going to come back to school for another year just because of how absurd this quarterback class is and the amount of people that literally can't come back to school, that have to go out, that are also first round or borderline first round prospects. I mean, looking at this list, guys that can't come back: Bo Nix, Joe Milton, Michael Penix. I don't think he has another year of eligibility. Well, I guess those three are the only really three that can't come back, but we figure Caleb Williams and Drake May are going out like 100% for sure. I think Quinn Ewers is also, you can throw into that category, 100% for sure going, because I'm not sure he ends up being the starting quarterback next year with Arch Manning behind him, even if he does return and does play like he played against Alabama for the rest of the year. And honestly, I think you can put Shedeur Sanders in that 100% going out camp as well. I just kind of got a feeling about him, just like a sort of vibe. I mean, he's firmly in the conversation for QB3 in this draft class for most people. I do think he would end up being a first round pick either way. So if he goes out in this 2024 draft class, I still think he's a first round pick. But if he stayed, I think he would be, depending upon who comes back and who leaves, he would probably be the consensus number 1 or number 2 overall pick heading into the 2025 NFL draft class. However, if he comes out in 2024, he's best case scenario QB3, and maybe if he's QB4 or 5, you'd end up falling to that middle of the first round area where you have teams that are really just like a quarterback away. So it might be a better situation for him to come out in 2024 with all of these QBs that are going to go high, that we know are going to go high. So for him specifically, it might be better for him to end up going out in 2024 to get into a better situation than if he were to stay and go out in 2025. But at the same time, you could get hurt in 2025 and then all of a sudden you're like a middle round pick because you're hurt. I don't know. There's a whole lot of nuance in discussions like this. If I was advising Shedeur Sanders, I would basically say it depends on who's coming out or not. I would tell him to wait until the absolute deadline to see if you can sniff out who's leaving and who's staying. As far as guys that I would advise to stay pretty much no matter what, that's 3 main ones. Riley Leonard out of Duke, I think he should stay no matter what. I don't think he is really best case scenario higher than QB6 in this draft class. Comes back, improves a little bit. Maybe Duke can get some more talented players around him through the transfer portal if they end up competing for the ACC this year, which they might be the 3rd best team in the ACC. I don't know. It's probably either them or Clemson, and they beat Clemson. I've got UNC 2 and Florida State 1 right now, so maybe they could go out and get him some more gifted athletes at the wide receiver position and potentially a better offensive line, or players could just improve and get better heading into next year. Then I think you could really solidify himself as a first round pick and maybe even like a top 10 guy. I don't particularly think he's like a number 1 overall pick sort of talent, but he could maybe even catapult himself into that sort of conversation. The second guy that I'm recommending stay in college no matter what, that's Cameron Ward out of Washington State. Already talked about it a little bit, but I think he's tremendously physically talented. I think he's a very, very, very good player. He honestly kind of reminds me of Russell Wilson a little bit, except for he's actually faster and more of a running threat than Russell Wilson. Similar arm strength, similar play style, just at like a basic level. And I get that Russell Wilson is sort of washed right now with the Broncos, but let's not forget that this guy made like 11 straight Pro Bowls and is a first ballot Hall of Famer and arguably one of the 10 best quarterbacks to ever play the game of football. So I don't particularly think we can forget that. So that is a lofty comparison. The last guy that I am like 100% you should be coming back for your senior season, so to speak, is J.J. McCarthy. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a Michigan fan and we don't particularly have an answer at quarterback next season. As a fan, that's like, oh yeah, sure, you want your best player to come back. But from a logistical standpoint with JJ McCarthy, again, best case scenario, you're QB3, but you're fighting with some guys that are just flat out more physically gifted than you and that are going to put up different kind of numbers than you. And the more physically gifted guys, that's Joe Milton if he can take off, Spencer Rattler. The guys that are just going to put up way better numbers than him, that's Shedeur Sanders, Michael Penix, Bo Nix. So you're competing with some bad matchups this year. Next year, you're competing with Drew Allar, and right now, nobody else. But even if we do see 2 or 3 of these guys come back that are going to be in the first round conversation, as well as probably some sophomores this year that I'm forgetting or don't know about, you're still only looking at a pool of probably 5 or 6 players, as opposed to like 9, 10, or 11 in the 2024 QB class. So A, just mathematically, you've got a better chance to go higher, but B, you could legitimately compete for the first overall pick. I think if Sanders were to come back, I think it would be J.J. McCarthy, Shedeur Sanders, and Drew Allar fighting for the first overall pick, as opposed to like Caleb Williams, we know is going 1, and Drake May is almost certainly going number 2 unless the Arizona Cardinals do that thing where they have the first pick and the second pick of the draft, in which case I think they probably just trade the second pick of the draft and net like 3 first-round picks. But I had them trading that pick in my 2024 mock draft that I did earlier on in the offseason. And I'm not even mentioning all of these other guys that could develop into starting caliber quarterbacks or way better, like Jordan Travis or Jaden Daniels or Grayson McCall or KJ Jefferson, because they're all just physically gifted that if you put them in the right situation, maybe they sit for a year or 2, they could develop into quality players in the NFL. So maybe some teams are willing to wait until day 2 or maybe even day 3 to take that developmental quarterback. So maybe of the 9, 10, 11 QBs that are going to be in contention for the first round, maybe only 5 or 6 end up going anyway. So I do think you're going to see 2 or 3 guys who in a normal class would almost certainly come out. It would be like 100%, 99%. They're definitely coming out. But now I think it's more like 50-50. And I think you're going to see 3 or 4, maybe even QBs stay and go into the 2025 QB class. The last thing we're going to do in this video here is really quickly we're going to discuss the AP Top 25, my Top 25, and where we differ on opinions, just because I think it's fairly interesting. The AP Top 25, going to run through it here real quick. Georgia 1, Michigan 2, Florida State 3, Texas 4, USC 5, Ohio State 6, Penn State 7, Washington 8, Notre Dame 9, Alabama 10, Tennessee 11, Utah 12, Oregon 13, LSU 14, Kansas State 15, Oregon State 16, Ole Miss 17, Colorado 18, Oklahoma 19, North Carolina 20, Duke 21, Miami, Florida 22, Washington State 23, UCLA 24, Iowa 25, and the 3 highest vote getters not ranked, Clemson, Arkansas, and TCU. My top 25 looks somewhat different. At 1, I have Georgia. I still think they have earned the number 1 spot because they have won back-to-back national titles. I've got Michigan 2, based off what they've done the past 2 seasons. I've also earned the number 2 spot. I think Florida State is 3 and Texas is 4. They have the 2 most impressive wins of the college football season this year. I have Ohio State and Penn State at 5 and 6. And for those last 4 teams, Florida State, Texas, Ohio State, and Penn State, if you want to put Texas 3 and Florida State at 4, I'm okay with that. If you want to put Penn State at 5 and Ohio State at 6, I'm also okay with that. But I do think we have sort of segments of 2 for this top 6 here, and then like a really solid 7 at Washington that I don't think has done enough to be above any of the 6 above them, but I think they're way better, or they just look way better than the teams below them. Alabama at 8 is an exception to that, but they have a loss to a top 5 ranked now Texas, and they lost quite convincingly. They lost by not a 1-score game, and they didn't particularly look all that great either. They still have massive question marks at quarterback, and the defense showed some kinks in the armor last week, so to speak. So they, I think, right now are below Washington in this discussion. Then you have 4 straight teams that, to me, haven't really proven anything, but I'm okay if you want to say that one of them is ranked over another or should be ranked over this other team, etc. And that group of 4 is Notre Dame, who I have at 9, USC, who I have at 10, Tennessee, who I have at 11, and Oregon, who I have at 12. And specifically, it's Oregon and Tennessee that if you want to put Oregon at 11, I can absolutely see that. If you want to put Tennessee at 12, I can absolutely see that. But those 4 teams, to me, are all teams that have legit playoff contender in their ceiling, but right now I haven't really seen it out of them. With Oregon, they've played Texas Tech, and they won by 8 points, but we don't know if Texas Tech is any good. They lost to North Texas. They might just not be good. I think they're a solid team, and I think that's going to end up being a solid out-of-conference resume booster for them if they end up, like a one-loss Pac-12 champion or something. But right now, we just don't know. Notre Dame, out of all of these teams, has the solidest win against North Carolina State. I think North Carolina State is a very good team. I think they're probably looking at 7-5, 8-4, maybe 9-3 if they can get some breaks. And that's a very consistent program as well. So that's a solid win, and that's why they're ranked 9. They have the most solid win. USC hasn't played anybody, and the defense looks awful. Tennessee hasn't played anybody, and the offense does not look as good as it was last year. Now, Joe Milton can maybe still turn it on. Maybe they're holding back for SEC play because they haven't played anybody out of conference and they're not going to. I don't know. There's a million reasons why Tennessee could not be looking great early on in the year and then end up being really good. So those 4 teams, to me, are all sort of in the same boat, and I do think that they have playoff contender in their ceiling, but right now they haven't done enough, to me, to put them higher than where they are. Then we have sort of the maybe they could surprise group of teams, the next 5 here. That's LSU at 13, Kansas State at 14, Oregon State at 15, Utah at 16, Oklahoma at 17, North Carolina at 18. These are all teams that, maybe if they pull off a surprise upset, then they could get some hype for a few weeks, but I think ultimately would fall short of being able to make the playoffs. For LSU, that might look like you end up upsetting Alabama and then you lose to Georgia in the SEC championship game. I think that's a fairly likely outcome. I mean, there are also other tough games on LSU's schedule, but I was just trying to use that as an example. The same sort of thing is for all of these teams. Oregon State plays 4 or 5 really tough Pac-12 teams. Maybe if they pull off an upset or 2, then they could get hyped up into the top 10, but I think they would probably falter a little bit. Utah, same camp. Oklahoma, on the other hand, they really only have to play Texas. I mean, like UCF could pull off an upset, Kansas could pull off an upset, but they don't play Kansas State. They don't play Texas Tech, who I thought coming into this year was the 4th best team in the Big 12. Might be wrong about that, but it's whatever. So Oklahoma has a very favorable schedule to 11-1. I don't think they can compete with Texas. I think Texas is on a different level. If they were playing Texas this week or week 4, I know they've done that a couple of times where they played week 4, then I would say they would maybe have a better chance. Texas maybe hang over from Alabama, but no, that's not when they play. I think they play week 7. I just think Texas is a different level than Oklahoma this year. But Oklahoma does have a fairly easy path to the Big 12 championship game, even with the loss to Texas. I think there's a decent probability they end up 11-1 and rematching with Texas in the Big 12 championship game. And if you lose the first one, your chances of winning the second one dramatically increase. North Carolina, I think, also has a similarly easy path to the ACC championship game. And if somehow they can end up undefeated with Florida State undefeated, 12-0 as well, they do not play during the regular season, then the ACC could make a hell of an argument to get 2 teams in, because North Carolina's out-of-conference schedule is absurdly good. They only play 3 out-of-conference games, but they played South Carolina, a Power 5 SEC team that a lot of people thought were going to surprise be really good this year, myself included. They played Appalachia State as well, which a solid and very consistent and well-coached program. And then this week they played Minnesota, which again, another middle-of-the-pack Power 5 team. Maybe they could surprise and win the West. They were somewhat talked about that, doing that in the Big Ten. So they have one of the best out-of-conference resumes if they can end up 3-0 in the entire country. And Florida State would have a win over either probably an 11-1 LSU team competing in the SEC championship or a 10-2 LSU team that's probably still ranked in the top 15. So they could make a serious argument to get two teams into the playoffs. Now, North Carolina, they don't play Florida State, but they do play Clemson. They play Miami as well, which that's probably going to be a shootout. So, shootouts, you never really know who's going to win because it might just come down to whoever has the ball last. And then you also got to worry about Duke, which is a really well-coached and solid football team. And then you end the year with North Carolina State, big rivalry game. You never know what could happen. Upsets happen all the time in rivalry games. And I do think North Carolina State would be extremely motivated to keep UNC out of the ACC championship and maybe the playoff altogether. 19 through 25, and then the honorable mentions. These are all teams that I think are good, but they're not really contending for anything. If they end up with the bowl game getting to 10 wins, then this is a very, very successful season. And I've got Colorado at 19, Duke at 20, Washington State at 21, Miami, Florida at 22, Iowa at 23, UCLA at 24, and Arkansas at 25, with my honorable mentions being Clemson, Ole Miss, and TCU. What are the biggest differences between me and the AP Top 25? Well, I think the three biggest and probably most impactful ones that I have on here is the AP has USC ranked at 5, and I have them ranked at 10. They have Ole Miss ranked at 17, and I have them unranked. They have Utah at 12, and I have them at 16. I just don't think USC, to me, has proven enough to be ranked in the top 5. I think the defense is still abysmal. I think it's very unlikely they come out of the Pac-12 without one loss, and fairly unlikely that they don't come out of the Pac-12 at all. I think by the middle of the season, once we start seeing them against Power 5 teams that have decent offenses, they honestly might be the third best team in the Pac-12 as like a best case scenario. And then we know they match up poorly with Utah. We know Utah loves playing USC and beating them. Washington is going to be an absolute slugfest for them. They play Notre Dame out of conference, and they also have to worry about Colorado a little bit too. Colorado might pull off a goddamn upset. That's perfectly possible in my mind that Colorado could pull off an upset, because I don't think USC's defense is capable of stopping goddamn anybody. Ole Miss, they just do this every year with Ole Miss. I think it's because Lane Kiffin is their head coach, and he's a name that's got some gravitas to him and all that, but I have seen nothing out of Ole Miss that makes me think they're going to be better than 7-5. Utah, I'm a little bit lower on, just because I think that the teams I've put ahead of them are better than they are. That could change when Cam Rising comes back, but I don't think Baylor is a particularly good team, and that was a struggle win. Then we had a whole bunch of teams where I was just maybe a little bit higher on them than the AP. I had Penn State at 6. They had them at 7. I had Washington at 7. The AP had them at 8. They had Oregon at 13. I had them at 12. They had LSU at 14. I had them at 13. They had Oregon State at 16. I had them at 15. I had Colorado they had them at 18. And then also I was a little bit higher on Alabama than they were. I was a little bit higher on Oklahoma than they were. I was a little bit higher on UNC, Duke, and Iowa, as well as Arkansas to end that off. Those ones are just a little bit, like they're all well within like a margin of error, so to speak. So it's not all that big of a deal that I had the differences. The most interesting to me is UNC, because I could absolutely see them in the playoff, and they are the currently lowest ranked team that I could see making the playoff. But that's just me. And what do I know? I'm just some asshole. I'm going to once again remind you to like if you like the video, subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Thank you for watching. I will see you next time.